Hey guys, so welcome to our first lecture in this new unit about evolution and creation, and this should be the most fun part of the class. So I'm glad that you guys were okay taking out a chapter and focusing more on these two chapters, chapter 10 and 11. Um, I'm proud of you guys for making it this far. Way to go. Way to get past this third test last week or on Tuesday. And yeah, let's get started on this. So, just so you know, we'll be only giving an introduction to evolution and common descent. And this is going to be on the first two sections of chapter 10, 1 through 2. So, I encourage you guys to read it. Also, just so you know, I posted a discussion board, and I would love for you to post on that before you watch this lecture. So it is super short, super sweet. It's just to ask a few questions and asks you to watch a short clip from the movie Noah. Um, so if you could pause this, if you haven't posted on the discussion board yet, pause this, go to the discussion board, select the evolution and creation thread, and just take a second to respond. Basically, it's asking what are your thoughts on what do you think the theory of evolution is? What does it state? And so that way you can kind of give your honest thoughts without hearing this introduction, and then you can come and and listen to this lecture. All right, so just a few comments before we start. Something I love to say is science and theology are not at odds. They are not enemies. They're actually complementary. So theology asks the who and the why questions, and science asks the how questions. I truly do not see these two at odds, having gone through a PhD program and now teaching biology, and having followed Jesus now for, what is it? 14 years of my life now. It's crazy. Um, these two are not at odds. It's taken me a while to get here, but they're not. And basically, as a Christian, if we truly believe that God created the world we live in, then understanding it is only going to reveal more about the Creator. So in Romans, Paul talks about how creation itself bears witness to humanity that God exists and that He is real. And so if truly God created the world, then it should reveal a, something about who God is, and understanding it more and understanding how it works and how life happens, it should reveal more about God, and it should cause us to worship Him because we're discovering how He does it and how He did it. Right? So that's my stance. And if we start from that point, then understanding biology, understanding life, exploring it is only a means to worship. All right, so with that in mind, let's start with chapter 10. So I asked you guys this question on the discussion board thread, and last few times I've done this, I've gotten different answers, but they all kind of fall in these categories. One, evolution explains how life on Earth arose. Evolution explains how all organisms today descended from a single ancestor. So the first one is how did the first cell even come to be? The second, general answer to the question is how did life go from one organism to all of the living organisms we see today? And then a lot of people say evolution says humans came from monkeys. So it's confusing, isn't it? Those descriptions of evolution probably sound right to you, but actually those go above and beyond what the theory of evolution actually states. So part of the confusion comes from the fact that the word evolution is used in everyday language to mean very different things. It's used to talk about the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of the species, natural selection, which would be more on the right track. But a basic definition of evolution and the theory of evolution is change in a population over time. I'm going to ask that we all learn that and get on the same page with that. That's truly what we're meaning, what I am meaning, and most scientists are meaning when we use the word evolution. It's a change in a population over time. Okay, so this chart here is an abbreviated because it's cut off. It's so big and complex it wouldn't fit on this slide. If I made it too small, you wouldn't be able to see anything. But this is a diagram that illustrates the diversity of life throughout what is considered the history of the world, the history of the earth. And the outer ring of this figure illustrates the current diversity of species on the planet. So if you go to the outermost ring of the graph, or not even the outermost ring, the outermost edge of the graph, those are organisms alive today. And this isn't even talking about species. I'm pretty sure this is at the level of genuses, which is each genus has multiple species in it. So this is just to illustrate that life is incredibly complex, that there is incredible diversity in life. And so the question is, how did this diversity of life arise? This is the question that drove many people to come up with ideas of evolution. So I want to give a very brief overview of the history of evolutionary thought, because probably most of you that are listening to this believe that Charles Darwin came up with the idea of evolution, of the theory of evolution, but actually that's far from the truth. The idea of evolution of life, of organic evolution, has been around since the times of Greek philosophers, which is 600, 500 years before Christ. So long, long, long ago, thinkers were already, I guess, cluing into the idea that the diversity of life arose through organic evolution. There's several pivotal people that led to the modern understanding of the theory of evolution, but I'm only going to mention three of them. Lamarck, back in the 1800s, early 1800s, articulated the idea of evolution through inherited traits. So adaptation. He basically proposed the idea that life adapts, which doesn't mean life simply responds to stimulus, but we can pass on genes that help us adapt to our environment. His idea was wrong, though, because he believed, for example, if you lost an arm, you could pass that on to your progeny, right? So if you cut off the tail of a mouse, that mouse's progeny, children, or I guess not children, little baby mice would be born without tails. So his idea was slightly wrong, but he was cluing in on the idea that we could pass on traits. But then Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace came along, and in the 1840s, so the mid 1800s, and actually you probably don't know the name Alfred Wallace, but he and Charles Darwin separately articulated the idea of evolution through natural selection, and they both made a strong case for common descent. So they both touched on the mechanism of evolution, which is natural selection, and the idea that all life on this earth arose from one common ancestor, which is common descent. But Charles Darwin is the one that got the most merit and the most credit. He published a little more on this and articulated well this idea. So how did he come up with the idea of evolution by natural selection? A lot of this begins with an epic journey he took on the Beagle, which is a ship that sailed across the globe. So this was when he was 31. He went on a 5-year journey around the globe. and that would be amazing. I'm 31 right now, so I would absolutely love to travel the world on a boat if I wasn't married and didn't have a child. But it just sounds awesome. And Charles Darwin was a naturalist, so he basically was fascinated with nature, would observe nature and record it, and he would have a little notebook and jot down drawings and observations of plants and animals. And when the ship landed on the Galapagos Islands, he observed some really unique things, specifically that animals and plants were uniquely adapted to the environment of each island. So the Galapagos Islands is a group of islands, and each island has a slightly different climate and slightly different vegetation, and the animals there were uniquely adapted to survive in those conditions. So, for example, he saw these finches. There were all these finches on the Galapagos Islands, but different islands had finches with different size beaks. So on islands that were more humid and had where the vegetation was more, it gave rise to fruits that were soft, and the birds could easily access the seeds of the fruit, um, or I guess easily eat the fruit. The birds had smaller, finer beaks, and as he once went to islands that were more desert-like, where the vegetation produced fruit that was rough, tough, and the seeds were hard, he found finches that had bigger, stronger beaks, right? So the finches were uniquely adapted to the vegetation and the temperature, the climate of the islands they lived on. Same thing with tortoises. So he saw tortoises on islands that had shorter vegetation, that had shorter necks, and on islands that had taller vegetation, he saw tortoises that had longer necks that could access their food more um, successfully. And so he would see these variations in how animals were uniquely suited for the environments. So those observations, along with fossils that he collected along the way, not just on the Galapagos, but throughout the whole journey, Darwin began laying the groundwork for his idea of evolution by natural selection. But it wasn't until 1859, which was 20 years after his journey on the Beagle, that he published his most famous work on the origin of the species. So it took him a long time to finally get comfortable with and work out the idea of evolution by natural selection, and actually work up the courage to publish this, because this was scandalous at the time, right? The culture at the time in Europe was dominated by a very religious mindset where if you dissented from what was in the Bible and what was believed by the church, which had a lot of power back then, you wouldn't be killed, but you'd probably be persecuted for your ideas, right? So he wanted to kind of work up the courage and a good case for evolution by natural selection, and he published this finally. So in his book, he proposed two main ideas, which we're going to touch on throughout the rest of our time together. One is evolution by natural selection, and the other one is common descent. And these are two different but closely related ideas. So what is natural selection? A good working definition, which we'll touch on and explain as we go on. It's the scientific theory that states environmental factors, or nature, selects for variations that help organisms reproduce more successfully. So after Darwin, a few people came along and coined the phrase survival of the fittest, which aptly describes evolution by natural selection. But that's it, survival of the fittest. Here's a quote from Darwin. I'm not going to read it. This is just for you guys to have. This is from his book on the origin of the species, and this is one of the quotes where he develops this idea of evolution by natural selection. And so you'll see there a few things bolded, but so any organism that varies slightly in any way that's profitable is going to have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. And any selected variety that's selected by nature will tend to propagate its new and modified form. So this is kind of where this idea of natural selection is found in his work. Now, what is common descent? Common descent is a scientific theory that states all present forms of life arose from one common ancestor. So here's the figure, the graph that I showed you guys at the beginning of the lecture in its full form. So obviously this is smaller, you can't see everything well, but now you get the idea. The idea is that at the very center, there was one organism that through evolution by natural selection gave rise to all of the diversity that we see today, right? So the theory of common descent applies the theory of evolution by natural selection to answer how the diversity of life on Earth arose. And this is also from his work on the origin of the species. So here I'll read this one because it's shorter, but Darwin states, "Therefore I should infer from analogy that probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some one primordial form into which life was first breathed." So I love this quote because it's talking about his idea that all organisms, he was already starting to think that all organisms on earth came from one ancestral organism. But get that he says that in that first organism, life was first breathed, right? By who? Obviously, he's referring to God here, which is interesting because Christians today typically think of Charles Darwin as the enemy of God. But actually, Charles Darwin was a decent, we don't know honestly where he was, but he was studying to become a priest before he went on the journey of the Beagle. And although he definitely expressed um, doubt, and it didn't seem like he was a believer, he definitely wasn't a atheist. And so it's just interesting to see that come through in his writings, right? Even Darwin, the one who proposed the idea of evolution by natural selection, couldn't conceive of life arising without this first breath of life. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this first taste of what we're going to be talking about in the next several weeks. And again, hopefully you already did your discussion board post, but that will be due on Tuesday, so make sure you go on and write a post if you haven't done so already. All right, guys, have a great rest of the week, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday.